the beginning of fear. Madame Koikoi was a name that struck terror into the hearts of students long before her infamous curse. In the 1970s, she was a teacher at St. Mark's Academy, a boarding school known for its strict discipline and high academic standards. The school prided itself on producing the best students in the region, and Madame Koikoi was everything St. Mark's stood for: intelligence, authority, and discipline. She was a striking woman. Her tall height and impeccable posture commanded attention wherever she went. Always dressed in perfectly ironed white shirt and red skirt, her signature red lipstick and matching high-heeled shoes completed the look. The click-clack of her heels was as recognizable as her sharp, commanding voice. Students said they could hear her coming from miles away, and they would scatter like frightened birds at the sound. But Madame Koikoi was more than just a strict teacher. She was mean, unyieldingly so. Her punishments were notorious. She once made a student kneel under the scorching sun for forgetting their notebook. Another time, she flogged an entire class because one of them had whispered during a lesson. For Madame Koikoi, discipline was the backbone of education, and she believed her methods were the only way to shape young minds into greatness. The students, however, saw her differently. To them, she was a cruel. They whispered stories about her behind her back, claiming she derived joy from their suffering. Some even believed she had no heart, but no one dared voice these thoughts within range of her. One stern glance from Madame Koikoi was enough to silence the bravest of souls. Despite her reputation, Madame Koikoi was brilliant at her job. Her students consistently outperformed others in regional exams, and parents often praised her during school meetings. The school administration adored her, seeing her as a cornerstone of their institution's success. This admiration only fueled Madame Koikoi's sense of self-importance. She believed she was all-important, untouchable. Then came the day that changed everything. It was an ordinary Thursday morning, and the students of Class 4B were seated in neat rows, terrified by their mathematics lesson. Madame Koikoi entered the classroom, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. The sound was sharp and precise, like the ticking of a clock counting down to doom. "Good morning, ma'am," the students chorused, their voices trembling. She didn't respond. Instead, she walked to the front of the class and began writing equations on the chalkboard. The room was silent, except for the squeak of chalk and the occasional cough. Everyone was too afraid to breathe too loudly, let alone whisper. Halfway through the lesson, something unexpected happened. A boy named Timothy, seated in the middle row, let out a soft chuckle. No one knew what had amused him, perhaps a stray thought or a memory, but the sound shattered the oppressive silence like glass. Madame Koikoi froze. Slowly she turned around, her eyes narrowing as they scanned the classroom. Who laughed?
The group fled, too terrified to continue their investigation. By the next morning, the story had spread throughout the school. Madame Koikoi's haunting was no longer just a rumor, it was a reality. Parents began withdrawing their children, and teachers started resigning. Within weeks, St. Mark's Academy was nearly empty. The final straw came when one of the students, a boy named Emeka, claimed to have seen her. He described a tall woman in a red skirt, her face shadowed but her high-heeled shoes unmistakable. She had been standing at the end of the corridor, watching him. She didn't move, Emeka said, his voice trembling. She just stood there, staring at me. Then, she disappeared. The principal had no choice but to close the school indefinitely. St. Mark's Academy, once a symbol of excellence, now stood abandoned. But Madame Koikoi's wrath didn't end there. With her former school deserted, she began extending her hauntings to other schools in the area, leaving a trail of fear and chaos in her wake. The closure of St. Mark's Academy was only the beginning. The legend of Madame Koikoi quickly spread beyond the school walls, whispered in homes, marketplaces, and bus stops across the region. Parents used her story to warn their children against misbehavior, while students told exaggerated versions to scare their peers. But for those who dismissed the tale as mere folklore, the truth soon revealed itself in chilling ways. It began with another school, Greenfield High, located just 20 miles from St. Mark's Academy. Known for its vibrant student body and rigorous academic program, Greenfield High was the last place anyone expected to fall victim to a haunting. But within weeks of St. Mark's closure, strange occurrences began to disrupt the school's once peaceful environment. One morning, as the students gathered for assembly, they noticed something peculiar on the freshly cleaned courtyard floor. Footprints, sharp, deep, and unmistakably those of high heels, stretched from the school gate to the main building. The principal, a stout man named Mr. Ojo, dismissed it as a prank. Probably some students trying to start trouble, he said, ordering the janitor to scrub the prints away. But by the next morning, they were back, this time, leading in a deliberate path around the assembly ground, forming a perfect circle. The students were terrified. Whispers of Madame Koikoi's return spread like wildfire. Teachers tried to reassure them, but their own growing fear was evident in their shaky voices and distracted gazes. Then came the noises. During quiet afternoons, when classes were in session, the sound of heels clicking against the tiled corridors would echo through the school. The noise was unmistakable, steady, deliberate, and always just out of sight. Students began refusing to leave their classrooms, huddling together in fear. Teachers, too, found themselves glancing nervously over their shoulders, half expecting to see a shadowy figure following them. The most chilling incident occurred one night during a school play rehearsal. A group of students and their drama teacher were in the auditorium, practicing their lines. The hall was dimly lit, with only the stage lights illuminating the space. As the rehearsal reached its climax, the sound began. Click-clack. Click-clack. It started faintly, as if coming from the far end of the corridor, but grew louder with each passing second. The students froze, their lines forgotten, as the sound approached the auditorium. "Is someone there?" the teacher called out, her voice trembling. The sound stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as the group stared at the auditorium doors, they slowly began to creak open. The students screamed, scattering in all directions. By the time the teachers arrived, the auditorium was empty, save for a trail of high-heeled footprints leading from the doors to the stage. The incident was the final straw for many parents, who began withdrawing their children from Greenfield High. Within months, the school, once a beacon of academic excellence, was deserted. As word of the haunting spread, other schools in the region began experiencing similar phenomena. Footprints appeared on freshly cleaned floors, the sound of heels echoed through empty corridors, and shadowy figures were spotted at the edge of playgrounds. At Westwood College, a boarding school renowned for its strict discipline, the headmistress herself encountered the ghost. Mrs. was known for her no-nonsense attitude and refusal to entertain superstitions. When reports of strange noises reached her office, she dismissed them as childish pranks and threatened severe punishment for anyone caught spreading rumors. One evening, as she worked late in her office, she heard the sound. Click-clack. Click-clack. Mrs. paused, her pen hovering over a stack of papers. The sound was faint but unmistakable, echoing down the corridor outside her door. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice firm. There was no response. Rising from her desk, Mrs. grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The beam of light revealed nothing but the polished floor and the long row of lockers. Yet, the sound persisted, growing louder as it moved toward her. Summoning her courage, she followed the noise to the school chapel. The doors creaked open as she approached, revealing the empty pews bathed in moonlight. At the altar, she saw them, footprints, circling the podium in a slow, deliberate pattern. For the first time in her career, Miss Is felt genuine fear. She fled the chapel, locking the doors behind her. The next day, she tendered her resignation, leaving the school without explanation. As more schools fell victim to the haunting, communities began to panic. Parents demanded answers, religious leaders performed exorcisms, and paranormal investigators flocked to the region. Yet, no one could provide a solution. Madame Koikoi's presence was undeniable, her wrath inescapable. The hauntings weren't limited to schools. In some cases, students reported seeing her figure in their dreams, a tall woman in a red suit, her face obscured but her high-heeled shoes glinting in the darkness. Others claimed to hear her laughter, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down their spines. Despite these terrifying encounters, some skeptics dismissed the stories as mass hysteria. There's no such thing as ghosts, declared Dr. Obina, a psychologist brought in to counsel frightened students. What you're experiencing is a collective delusion, fueled by fear and suggestion. But even he couldn't explain the physical evidence, the footprints, the noises, and the inexplicable code that seemed to follow her presence. By the end of the year, over a dozen schools had been abandoned, leaving thousands of students without access to education. The once thriving communities were now shrouded in fear, their streets empty after dark. Madame Koikoi had become a specter of terror, her legend growing with each passing day. Yet, amid the chaos, one question lingered: why had she chosen to expand her wrath beyond St. Mark's Academy? What fueled her relentless haunting of innocent schools and students? The answer lay in the story of her son, Koikoi, a story that had yet to be uncovered. Amid the chaos that Madame Koikoi's haunting had unleashed, few remembered that she had left behind a son. Koikoi was only 10 years old when his mother died, a quiet and reserved boy who had lived in the shadow of her strict reputation. Before her death, Koikoi's life was far from normal. He rarely saw his mother, as her days were consumed by her teaching and her nights spent grading papers or preparing lessons. On the rare occasions they did spend time together, her demeanor remained stern. She demanded excellence from him, as she did from her students, and would not tolerate any display of weakness. Discipline and strength, she often told him. That's how you survive in this world. Despite her harshness, Koikoi loved his mother. He admired her intelligence and confidence, though he often wished she could be gentler with him. When news of her death reached him, it shattered the fragile sense of stability he had clung to. Koikoi was sent to live with a distant relative, an aunt who begrudgingly took him in. She made it clear that she only did so out of obligation. Your mother was a difficult woman, she often muttered under her breath, her disapproval evident. Life in his aunt's house was lonely. Koikoi was given a small room at the back of the house, far from the warmth of family life. Meals were sparse, and any attempt to engage with his cousins was met with ridicule. They teased him mercilessly, calling him the ghost son, and blaming him for every mishap in the household. At school, things were no better. Word of Madame Koikoi's haunting had spread, and Koikoi was immediately ostracized by his peers. Teachers avoided him, their discomfort evident in the way they hurried through lessons whenever he was in the room. "He's cursed," one of his classmates whispered. "His mother is the one haunting all those schools." The rumor spread quickly, and soon, no one wanted to sit near Koikoi. He ate alone during lunch, walked home alone after school, and spent his evenings in his small, dark room, replaying the taunts and whispers in his mind. The discrimination he faced was relentless. During a group project, his classmates refused to work with him. During recess, he sat alone under a tree, watching the other children laugh and play as if he didn't exist. But it was the teacher's behavior that hurt the most. One day, during a science lesson, Kyuli raised his hand to answer a question. The teacher ignored him, her gaze fixed firmly on the opposite side of the room. When he persisted, she snapped, "Put your hand down, Kyuli. Someone else will answer." The rejection was crushing. Kyuli stopped participating in class, retreating further into himself. His grades began to slip, not because he lacked intelligence but because he no longer saw the point in trying. At night, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about his mother. He wondered if she had truly become the vengeful spirit the stories described. Was she watching him? Did she know how much he was suffering? His health began to deteriorate. He ate less and less, unable to stomach the constant tension that weighed on him. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and his once bright demeanor dimmed into a hollow, silent presence. 2 months after his mother's death, Kyuli stopped going to school altogether. His aunt, already annoyed by his presence, made little effort to intervene. She would occasionally mutter about him being a burden, but otherwise left him to fend for himself. One cold evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Kyuli remained in his room. He hadn't eaten all day, but the thought of facing his cousin's sneers and his aunt's cold glares was too much to bear. When his aunt finally checked on him later that night, she found him lying on the floor, unresponsive. A rush trip to the local clinic revealed the worst. Kyuli had died from a combination of malnutrition and severe depression. His death sent shockwaves through the community. While some mourned the loss of an innocent boy, others whispered that it was a consequence of his mother's curse. Kyuli never stood a chance, one neighbor said. He was doomed from the moment Madame Koikoi died. But if the world thought Kyuli's death marked the end of the tragedy, they were wrong. His passing only fueled Madame Koikoi's rage. It was said that the night of Kyuli's burial was eerily quiet. No wind rustled the trees, no crickets chirped. But as the mourners dispersed, leaving the freshly covered grave behind, the silence was broken by a familiar sound. Click-clack. Click-clack. The sound of high heels echoed through the cemetery, sending the remaining mourners fleeing in terror. When they returned the next morning, they found footprints circling Kyuli's grave, pressed deep into the soft earth. From that day forward, Madame Koikoi's hauntings grew more intense. Her wrath, once directed solely at schools, now seemed to encompass anyone who had wronged her or her son. Teachers who had ignored Kyuli began experiencing unexplainable events, doors slamming shut on their own, objects falling from shelves, and the sound of footsteps following them wherever they went. Students who had bullied Kyuli reported seeing a shadowy figure at the edge of their vision, always watching, always waiting. Some claimed to hear whispers in the night, a voice cold and hollow, calling their names. Communities began to fear not just Madame Koikoi but the legacy of her anger. Schools that had once dismissed the rumors now held prayer sessions and hired spiritual leaders to cleanse their grounds. But nothing seemed to work. Madame Koikoi's presence was unrelenting, her vengeance unstoppable. And so, a legend grew, entwined with the tragic story of her son. To this day, the name Kyuli is spoken in hushed tones, a reminder of the devastating cost of cruelty and the lengths a mother's love, twisted and vengeful, can go to protect her child. The tragic death of Kyuli marked a turning point in Madame Koikoi's haunting. While her wrath had initially been directed at the school where she had been dismissed, it now spread indiscriminately, fueled by the injustice her son had suffered. To those who knew the story, it became clear that her curse was not just vengeance, it was a mother's grief, twisted and amplified by her untimely death. Across the region, reports of supernatural occurrences increased. Schools that had previously considered themselves safe were now grappling with the same eerie phenomena that had plagued St. Mark's Academy. Footprints would appear on freshly cleaned floors, the sharp sound of high heels would echo through silent corridors, and doors would slam shut without warning. At one school, Victoria Memorial College, the haunting took a particularly sinister turn. It began with minor disturbances, lights flickering, textbooks disappearing from classrooms, and unexplained code drafts. But soon, the students and staff realized they were dealing with something far more malevolent. One morning, as the janitor mopped the school's main hallway, he noticed a single set of high-heeled footprints leading from the entrance to the principal's office. What unnerved him was the depth of the prints, as though the heels had been driven forcefully into the floor. The principal, a skeptical man named Mr. Ade, dismissed the janitor's report. "It's probably a prank," he said, waving away the man's concerns. But later that day, as Mr. Ade sat in his office, he heard the sound. Click-clack. Click-clack. The rhythmic tapping of heels echoed in the hallway outside his door. At first, he assumed it was one of the teachers, but when he stepped out to investigate, the hallway was empty. Yet the sound persisted, moving slowly but deliberately away from him. Determined to prove it was nothing more than a trick of his imagination, Mr. Ade followed the sound. It led him to the library, a dimly lit room lined with rows of dusty books. The air was heavy, and the faint scent of perfume lingered, floral, with a sharp, metallic undertone. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure at the far end of the room, a tall woman in a red suit, her face obscured by shadow.
The figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the message was clear: Madam Koikoi was real, and she had come to Victoria Memorial College. News of the incident spread quickly, and fear gripped the school. Parents began withdrawing their children, and teachers resigned in droves. The few who remained tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible to ignore the growing sense of dread that hung over the campus. One particularly chilling event occurred during a biology lesson. The teacher, Mrs. Akin, was explaining the process of photosynthesis when the sound of heels interrupted her. Click-clack. Click-clack. The noise grew louder, as if someone were walking directly toward the classroom. The students froze, their eyes wide with fear. Mrs. Akin tried to continue her lecture, but her voice faltered. Then, the door to the classroom creaked open. The students screamed and scrambled to the back of the room, but no one was there. Only the footprints remained, leading from the doorway to the teacher's desk and then back out into the hallway. Victoria Memorial College was forced to close its doors within weeks. It joined the growing list of schools abandoned in the wake of Madam Koikoi's curse. As more schools succumbed to the haunting, the region descended into chaos. Parents were afraid to send their children to school, and many communities were left without access to education. Religious leaders held prayer sessions and exorcisms, but nothing seemed to stop Madam Koikoi. Some schools tried to adapt, implementing strict rules to avoid angering the spirit. Students were forbidden from wearing red clothing, and teachers avoided mentioning her name. But even these precautions couldn't guarantee safety. At St. Teresa's boarding school, a group of students decided to test the limits of the curse. They gathered in the dormitory late at night, whispering about the legend. One of the girls, Ada, was particularly bold. "It's all just a story to scare us," she said, standing in the middle of the room. "Madam Koikoi isn't real. And even if she is, what can she do to us?" The other girls begged her to stop, but Ada was determined to prove her point. She picked up a red scarf and wrapped it around her neck. "See. Nothing's happening." At first, it seemed she was right. The room remained silent, and the girls began to relax. But then, the sound started. Click-clack. Click-clack. The footsteps were faint at first, but they grew louder with each passing second. The girls huddled together, their eyes darting around the room. The sound stopped just outside their door. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn. The door swung open, revealing an empty hallway. But on the floor, a single set of high-heeled footprints led directly to Ada's bed. The next morning, Ada was gone. Her bed was empty, and her belongings were untouched. The school conducted a frantic search, but there was no trace of her. Some claimed she had run away, but others believed she had been taken by Madame Koikoi. The incident cemented the legend of Madame Koikoi as a force to be feared. Schools across the region scrambled to find solutions, but none could escape her wrath. Amid the growing panic, those who had wronged Madame Koikoi in life began to reflect on their actions. Former colleagues and students who had witnessed her dismissal recalled the humiliation she endured and the fury in her eyes as she left the school grounds. "I remember the way she looked at us," said Mrs. Johnson, a retired teacher who had worked alongside Madame Koikoi. "It was as if she was saying, 'You regret this.' At the time, I thought it was just her pride. But now I wonder if she really did curse us." Others pointed to Kuli's death as the true catalyst for the curse. Many of his classmates, now adults, admitted to the bullying and isolation he faced. "We were cruel to him," one former student confessed. "We treated him like he wasn't even human. And now, I can't help but think that we're paying the price for what we did." But guilt offered no solace to those living in fear of Madame Koikoi. Her curse was relentless, and no amount of regret or repentance seemed to satisfy her vengeance. As Madame Koikoi's curse spread, her story became a topic of both terror and debate. Communities gathered to discuss how to confront the relentless spirit, but few dared to take action. Desperation mounted as schools remained closed, children were deprived of education, and families feared the sound of clicking heels in the night. It was during this time of growing dread that a bold group of spiritual leaders and traditionalists stepped forward to challenge the curse. Led by Pastor Gabriel, an influential preacher known for his fiery sermons, the group also included Baba Agba, a revered herbalist, and Fatima, a young but gifted seer. The trio met in Pastor Gabriel's modest home one sweltering evening. The air was thick with incense, and the flickering light of a single oil lamp cast long shadows on the walls. "We cannot let this spirit destroy our future," Pastor Gabriel declared, his voice resolute. "Our children deserve to learn, to grow, to live without fear. This curse must be broken." Baba Akbar nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "Madame Koikoi's spirit is powerful, yes, but she is bound by pain and anger. If we can find the source of her unrest, we may be able to put her soul to rest." Fatima, her eyes sharp and unblinking, spoke softly but with conviction. "Her pain is tied to her death, but it is her son's suffering that fuels her wrath. We must acknowledge her grief and confront her directly." The plan was set. They would travel to the last school Madame Koikoi had haunted, St. Teresa's boarding school, and attempt to summon her spirit. The goal was to understand her grievances and offer her a chance to find peace. The following week was spent in intense preparation. Pastor Gabriel fasted and prayed, seeking divine guidance. Baba Akbar gathered rare herbs, roots, and talismans said to ward off evil spirits. Fatima meditated in solitude, honing her abilities to communicate with the other side. Word of their plan spread quickly, and a small crowd gathered to watch them depart for St. Teresa's. Among the crowd were students who had experienced Madame Koikoi's wrath firsthand, their faces pale with fear. "Do you really think you can stop her?" a young boy asked Baba Akbar, his voice trembling. "We will do our best, child," the old man replied. "But remember, spirits are like us. They need to be understood, not just feared." The trio arrived at St. Teresa's just before sunset. The abandoned school loomed before them, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. The air was unnaturally cold, and the faint scent of perfume lingered, a reminder of the entity they were about to confront. In the school's central courtyard, they set up a small altar. Baba Akbar placed a calabash filled with herbs and sacred water at the center, while Pastor Gabriel lit a circle of white candles. Fatima sat cross-legged nearby, her eyes closed as she whispered an incantation under her breath. As darkness fell, the atmosphere grew heavy. The wind howled through the empty corridors, and the sound of clicking heels echoed faintly in the distance. "She is coming," Fatima said, her voice steady but low. The group formed a circle around the altar, their hands clasped tightly. Pastor Gabriel began to pray aloud, his words a mixture of supplication and command. Spirit of Madam Koikoi, we summon you. Come forth, not in wrath, but in truth. Let us speak and understand your pain. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the candles flickered violently, and the temperature dropped further. The clicking heels grew louder, as if approaching from all directions at once. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the candles flickered violently, and the temperature dropped further. The clicking heels grew louder, as if approaching from all directions at once. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging the courtyard into darkness. When the light returned, this time from the eerie glow of the full moon, she was there. Madam Koikoi stood at the edge of the circle, her figure tall and imposing. She wore a crimson suit, her high heels gleaming in the dim light. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her presence was suffocating, radiating anger and sorrow. You dare summon me? Madam Koikoi's voice was sharp and cold, cutting through the air like a blade. You think you can stop what I have begun? Fatima stepped forward cautiously, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. We do not wish to fight you, Madam Koikoi. We only wish to understand. Why do you torment these schools? What can we do to ease your pain? The spirit's laughter was hollow and bitter. Ease my pain. My pain cannot be eased. My son is dead because of their cruelty, their indifference. They laughed while he suffered, while he wasted away. And now, they will know my grief. Baba Akbar spoke next, his voice calm but firm. Your pain is valid, Madam Koikoi. But your vengeance harms more than those who wronged you. Innocent children suffer because of your actions. Is this what you want? For a moment, the spirit faltered. The glow around her dimmed slightly, and her posture softened. I only want justice, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Pastor Gabriel stepped forward, holding a Bible in one hand and a cross in the other. Justice cannot be achieved through hatred and destruction. Let us help you find peace, so your soul and your sons can rest. Madam Koikoi's anger flared again, her figure towering over the trio. You think you can understand my pain? Then prove it. Face the suffering I endured, and the torment my son faced. Only then will I consider your offer. Before anyone could respond, the world around them shifted. The courtyard dissolved, replaced by a series of vivid, nightmarish scenes. They saw Madam Koikoi's final moments, the humiliation of her dismissal, the violent accident that claimed her life, and the desperate curses she uttered as she bled on the roadside. Then came Kyoli's suffering. The isolation, the taunts, the neglect. Each memory was more harrowing than the last, a relentless assault on the senses. By the time the visions ended, the trio was trembling, their faces pale. Madam Koikoi watched them with a cold, unreadable expression. Now you know, she said. Do you still think I can forgive? Fatima, despite her exhaustion, found the strength to speak. We cannot erase the past, Madam Koikoi. But we can honor your memory and your sons by ensuring no child suffers as he did. Let us work together to make this right. Baba Akbar nodded in agreement. We will hold those responsible accountable. But your wrath must end. Let the children go, and we will make sure your story is told, your pain acknowledged. Pastor Gabriel stepped forward one last time. Let your son's soul guide you, Madam Koikoi. He would not want this endless cycle of suffering. Release your anger, and find peace in his memory. The spirit hesitated, her form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. For the first time, she seemed uncertain. I will consider your words, she said finally. But know this, if you fail to keep your promises, my wrath will return tenfold. With that, Madam Koikoi vanished, leaving the courtyard eerily silent. The trio exchanged weary glances, knowing their work was far from over. The eerie silence that followed Madam Koikoi's departure from St. Teresa's boarding school left Pastor Gabriel, Baba Akbar, and Fatima in a state of uneasy relief. The spirit had acknowledged their plea, but her parting words hung heavy in the air, a chilling reminder that her wrath was not so easily quelled. If you fail to keep your promises, my wrath will return tenfold. The weight of those words settled like a thick fog, clouding their thoughts. The trio returned to their respective homes, each one deeply affected by the experience. For days, Pastor Gabriel found himself locked in fervent prayer, seeking divine guidance on how to keep the promise they had made to Madam Koikoi. Baba Akbar went into isolation, preparing a potent concoction of herbs and charms he believed might aid in their mission. Fatima, despite her own exhaustion, continued her meditations, determined to communicate further with the spirit if the need arose. However, as the days passed, it became evident that the curse Madam Koikoi had cast upon the schools was far from over. Several more schools had been abandoned in the wake of her terror. The once thriving educational institutions were now ghost towns, their halls empty, their classrooms left to decay. News spread quickly. 2 more schools in neighboring villages had fallen victim to the curse. St. Teresa's boarding school, the site of the confrontation with the spirit, had been closed indefinitely after a series of unexplained incidents. The students had fled, and no teacher dared to return. Yet, despite this, the authorities insisted that they would reopen the school soon. The people, however, were not so sure. The fear was palpable, as parents refused to send their children to schools where the specter of Madam Koikoi loomed. It was clear that the situation was growing more dire with each passing day. The pact made with the spirit had yet to be fulfilled. The promise to ensure no child would suffer as Kuli had was still an unfulfilled task. At a secret meeting in the back room of Pastor Gabriel's church, the group convened to discuss their next course of action. The room was dimly lit, filled with the smoke of burning incense and the heavy scent of earth from Baba Akbar's herbal preparations. "Time is running out," Pastor Gabriel said, his voice strained with the weight of his responsibility. "Madam Koikoi has given us a chance. But we cannot afford to delay any longer. We must act swiftly." Fatima nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We have to ensure that those responsible for Kuli's suffering face justice. And that includes the teachers, the students who bullied him, and the administration that allowed such cruelty to continue unchecked." Baba Akbar, who had been silently grinding herbs into a paste, looked up. His old eyes were filled with a depth of sadness. Justice is not always easily delivered, especially when it involves the powerful. But we must be bold. We must confront the ones who wronged Kuli, even if they are no longer in positions of authority. The conversation turned to their next move. They knew that the only way to stop the curse for good was to put the spirit's grievances to rest. This meant confronting the individuals who had directly caused Kuli's torment and ensuring that they faced the consequences of their actions. The authorities, the school officials, and even the students who had mocked and bullied Kuli needed to come forward and acknowledge their sins. A public tribunal was the only solution. Fatima's seer abilities would help them locate the perpetrators, and Baba Akbar's herbal remedies would provide protection against any evil spirits that might try to stop them. Pastor Gabriel would lead the charge, rallying the community to demand justice. The tribunal was set for the following month. It would be held in the central square of the town, a public space where the entire community could witness the event. Flyers were posted, and announcements made. The 3 leaders hoped that enough people would attend to make the event meaningful and hold those responsible accountable for their actions. Victoria Memorial College was forced to close its doors within weeks. It joined the growing list of schools abandoned in the wake of Madam Koikoi's curse. As more schools succumbed to the haunting, the region descended into chaos. Parents were afraid to send their children to school, and many communities were left without access to education. Religious leaders held prayer sessions and exorcisms, but nothing seemed to stop Madam Koikoi. Some schools tried to adapt, implementing strict rules to avoid angering the spirit. Students were forbidden from wearing red clothing, and teachers avoided mentioning her name. But even these precautions couldn't guarantee safety. At St. Teresa's boarding school, a group of students decided to test the limits of the curse. They gathered in the dormitory late at night, whispering about the legend. One of the girls, Ada, was particularly bold. "It's all just a story to scare us," she said, standing in the middle of the room. "Madam Koikoi isn't real. And even if she is, what can she do to us?" The other girls begged her to stop, but Ada was determined to prove her point. She picked up a red scarf and wrapped it around her neck. See? Nothing's happening. At first, it seemed she was right. The room remained silent, and the girls began to relax. But then, the sound started. Click-clack. Click-clack. The footsteps were faint at first, but they grew louder with each passing second. The girls huddled together, their eyes darting around the room. The sound stopped just outside their door. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn. The door swung open, revealing an empty hallway. But on the floor, a single set of high-heeled footprints led directly to Ada's bed. The next morning, Ada was gone. Her bed was empty, and her belongings were untouched. The school conducted a frantic search, but there was no trace of her. Some claimed she had run away, but others believed she had been taken by Madame Koikoi. The incident cemented the legend of Madame Koikoi as a force to be feared. Schools across the region scrambled to find solutions, but none could escape her wrath. Amid the growing panic, those who had wronged Madame Koikoi in life began to reflect on their actions. Former colleagues and students who had witnessed her dismissal recalled the humiliation she endured and the fury in her eyes as she left the school grounds. "I remember the way she looked at us," said Mrs. Johnson, a retired teacher who had worked alongside Madame Koikoi. "It was as if she was saying, 'You regret this.' At the time, I thought it was just her pride. But now I wonder if she really did curse us." Others pointed to Cooley's death as the true catalyst for the curse. Many of his classmates, now adults, admitted to the bullying and isolation he faced. "We were cruel to him," one former student confessed. "We treated him like he wasn't even human. And now, I can't help but think that we are paying the price for what we did." But guilt offered no solace to those living in fear of Madame Koikoi. Her curse was relentless, and no amount of regret or repentance seemed to satisfy her vengeance. As Madame Koikoi's curse spread, her story became a topic of both terror and debate. Communities gathered to discuss how to confront the relentless spirit, but few dared to take action. Desperation mounted as schools remained closed, children were deprived of education, and families feared the sound of clicking heels in the night. It was during this time of growing dread that a bold group of spiritual leaders and traditionalists stepped forward to challenge the curse. Led by Pastor Gabriel, an influential preacher known for his fiery sermons, the group also included Baba Agba, a revered herbalist, and Fatima, a young but gifted seer. The trio met in Pastor Gabriel's modest home one sweltering evening. The air was thick with incense, and the flickering light of a single oil lamp cast long shadows on the walls. "We cannot let this spirit destroy our future," Pastor Gabriel declared, his voice resolute. "Our children deserve to learn, to grow, to live without fear. This curse must be broken." Baba Akbar nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "Madame Koikoi's spirit is powerful, yes, but she is bound by pain and anger. If we can find the source of her unrest, we may be able to put her soul to rest." Fatima, her eyes sharp and unblinking, spoke softly but with conviction. "Her pain is tied to her death, but it is her son's suffering that fuels her wrath. We must acknowledge her grief and confront her directly." The plan was set. They would travel to the last school Madame Koikoi had haunted, St. Teresa's boarding school, and attempt to summon her spirit. The goal was to understand her grievances and offer her a chance to find peace. The following week was spent in intense preparation. Pastor Gabriel fasted and prayed, seeking divine guidance. Baba Akbar gathered rare herbs, roots, and talismans said to ward off evil spirits. Fatima meditated in solitude, honing her abilities to communicate with the other side. Word of their plan spread quickly, and a small crowd gathered to watch them depart for St. Teresa's. Among the crowd were students who had experienced Madame Koikoi's wrath firsthand, their faces pale with fear. "Do you really think you can stop her?" a young boy asked Baba Akbar, his voice trembling. "We will do our best, child," the old man replied. "But remember, spirits are like us. They need to be understood, not just feared." The trio arrived at St. Teresa's just before sunset. The abandoned school loomed before them, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. The air was unnaturally cold, and the faint scent of perfume lingered, a reminder of the entity they were about to confront. In the school's central courtyard, they set up a small altar. Baba Akbar placed a calabash filled with herbs and sacred water at the center, while Pastor Gabriel lit a circle of white candles. Fatima sat cross-legged nearby, her eyes closed as she whispered an incantation under her breath. As darkness fell, the atmosphere grew heavy. The wind howled through the empty corridors, and the sound of clicking heels echoed faintly in the distance. "She is coming," Fatima said, her voice steady but low. The group formed a circle around the altar, their hands clasped tightly. Pastor Gabriel began to pray aloud, his words a mixture of supplication and command. "Spirit of Madam Koikoi, we summon you. Come forth, not in wrath, but in truth. Let us speak and understand your pain." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the candles flickered violently, and the temperature dropped further. The clicking heels grew louder, as if approaching from all directions at once.
Pastor Gabriel, Baba Akbar, and Fatima were immediately summoned by the town council to address the growing fear. The news had reached them quickly, and the urgency in the air was palpable. The council chamber was crowded, the weight of the people's expectations pressing down on the three leaders. As they entered, the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on them. The mayor, a portly man with a furrowed brow, stood up. Pastor Gabriel, Baba Akbar, Fatima, the mayor said, his voice grave. It seems your efforts have not been enough to quell the spirit of Madam Koikoi. The people are afraid. The sound of our heels is echoing again, and our children are once more in danger. What will you do? Pastor Gabriel cleared his throat, stepping forward. We understand the fear in the community. Madam Koikoi's spirit is indeed restless, but we believe that her wrath will subside only when the promises made are kept fully. It is not enough to just acknowledge the wrongs done to Kuli, the healing must continue. Fatima's eyes, wide with the clarity of one who had seen beyond the veil, spoke next. Her anger is tied to her son's suffering. But there is also a deeper pain, a pain of injustice that goes beyond her death. We must continue to teach the next generation the lessons we have learned. We must show Madam Koikoi that we are committed to change. Baba Akbar's voice was deep and resolute. Madam Koikoi is not a spirit that can be appeased through words alone. We must prove to her that we are sincere. This means continuing to hold those responsible for Kuli's suffering accountable. We must ensure that this generation never forgets the pain of the past. The mayor looked uneasy. And if this is not enough? We will try a final approach, Pastor Gabriel said quietly. We will offer her the peace she craves, and if she refuses it, we will face whatever comes. It was clear that the situation was growing more dire. The town was on the brink, and the leaders knew that they had one final chance to make things right. That night, as the wind howled through the streets and the moon shone with a cold, silver light, the trio gathered once more at St. Teresa's. The building, once abandoned, had been partially restored, and now stood as a reminder of the past lingering specter. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the entire town was holding its breath. The trio entered the school, the familiar sound of their footsteps echoing in the dark halls. They reached the main courtyard, where the confrontation with Madame Koikoi had begun. Fatima closed her eyes, concentrating deeply. She could feel the presence, faint at first, like the stirring of a breeze. Then, it grew stronger. Madame Koikoi's spirit was near. "She's here," Fatima whispered. Just as the words left her mouth, a sharp, familiar sound cut through the silence. The clicking of high heels echoed down the corridor, reverberating off the walls. And then, in the darkness, the figure appeared, Madame Koikoi, as imposing as ever, standing at the end of the hall. Her eyes were shadowed, but her anger was palpable. "You have failed," Madame Koikoi's voice echoed through the corridor, colder than the night air. "Your promises are empty. You think you can end my wrath with words and false promises." Pastor Gabriel stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with authority. "We have kept our word. We are committed to seeing this through, but we need your trust. We will continue to work for peace. Let us help you find rest." Madame Koikoi's eyes narrowed. "You think peace can come through your actions? You think you can erase the pain of a mother who has lost her son?" Baba Akbar raised a hand. "No, we cannot erase your pain, Madame Koikoi. But we can work to ensure that no more children are made to suffer as your son did." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Madame Koikoi's form began to flicker and shift, her anger fading into a quiet sorrow. "I will consider your words," she said, her voice softer now. "But you must prove it. If you fail, I will return." With that, she vanished, leaving behind the faintest trace of perfume, a lingering reminder of a mother's grief. The night after Madame Koikoi's latest appearance, the people of the town were left in a state of uncertainty, torn between hope and fear. The leaders, Pastor Gabriel, Baba Akbar, and Fatima, were quietly considering their next move. The spirit had spoken, but her words were unclear, leaving them in limbo. Would she grant them the peace they so desperately sought, or would she return in full force, her wrath magnified by their failure to truly appease her? The days that followed were tense. Though Madame Koikoi had disappeared without leaving further destruction in her wake, there was no denying the heaviness in the air. The schools were open, but the students and teachers walked around with their eyes constantly searching the shadows. The fear of hearing those dreadful clicking heels echoed through every hallway. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind, was a reminder that the spirit had not left. No one felt truly safe. In the midst of this unease, Pastor Gabriel called another meeting with Baba Akbar and Fatima. It was clear that they had to take action, but what that action should be was a matter of great debate. "It's been over a week, and nothing has changed," Pastor Gabriel said, his voice full of frustration as he paced back and forth in the small room where they had gathered. "The fear is still there, and the schools remain in danger. We were promised a chance, but we've done all we can, and yet her wrath lingers. What more can we do?" Baba Akbar sat silently, his hands resting on his lap. His old eyes were clouded with thought. After a moment, he spoke slowly, as if every word was weighed down by the gravity of the situation. "The promise you made to her cannot be one-sided. She has suffered too much. Perhaps our words were not enough. We must show her that we are truly committed to making things right." Fatima, who had been deep in thought for most of the conversation, suddenly spoke, her voice calm but firm. "The spirit needs to see more than just our actions. She needs to see the town itself change. There must be a deeper transformation. If we do not show Madam Koikoi that her pain has been understood, and that we are willing to go to great lengths to prevent another child from suffering as Kuli did, she will never leave. Pastor Gabriel stopped pacing and looked at Fatima, his face filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. What do you suggest? I think it's time we make a more personal sacrifice, Fatima replied, her voice steady. The cause will only end when the town is truly united in its commitment to change. We need to offer something more, something that will symbolize our sincerity. I've seen it in my visions. A ceremony, something that acknowledges not just Madam Koikoi's pain, but also the pain of every child who has suffered at the hands of the adults. We must publicly vow to ensure that no child ever faces the same torment again. Baba Akbar nodded slowly, his gnarled fingers touching his chin. A ceremony, yes. But it must be a public one. Something that the entire town can participate in. It must be a ritual that brings us all together to prove our sincerity and our unity. Pastor Gabriel took a deep breath, his mind walking through the idea. And what exactly would this ceremony entail? Fatima's gaze grew distant, her eyes unfocused as if she were looking into another world. The ceremony will be held at the heart of the town, at the school where Kuli died. We will ask for forgiveness, not just from Madam Koikoi, but from every child who has been hurt, every child who has been overlooked. We will make promises, not just to her, but to ourselves. We will vow to create a new future for our children, a future free from cruelty, neglect, and violence.